Hey Tales from the Classroom community, welcome back to another iteration of our Visions of Good Education series. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with educator and social justice advocate, Deonna Smith. Deonna, do you want to take a minute and just introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Deonna Smith. I am currently an administrator, but I used to be a mathematics instructor, middle school math, and I also taught self-contained intervention for a while as well. I am a Spokane, Washington native, but right now I live in Los Angeles. And as Rachel already mentioned, I'm passionate about social justice, anti-racism, and abolitionist educational practices.
Awesome. I'm really excited that you mentioned abolitionist. That's something I really want to talk about with you more. I think that's something that a lot of our readers are maybe not familiar with. And I think it's something that I'm really excited that we have somebody that's knowledgeable and ready to talk about.
Yes.
But before we get there, I'd love to just kind of hear about how you got involved in education, what kind of brought you into this work. And then, I mean, you've done so much with education, kind of how you've gotten all the way to where you are right now.
Okay, my journey in education. So it starts off with me as a student. When I was a student, I mentioned before, I'm from Spokane, Washington. So are not a lot of people of color there. It's getting better, but when I was there, I was the only person of color in my entire elementary school.
Wow.
So I didn't have any Black teachers, and I've actually still to this day not have any Black teachers going through K-12 education, my undergrad, my master's, and I'm in a doctoral program now and still have yet to have a Black teacher.
Wow.
So when I was a student, that obviously had an impact on what I felt like my options were when I became an adult. And initially, when I went to my undergrad, I went to Gonzaga University in Spokane. If you're a basketball fan, you might have heard of it. And I didn't intend on going into education. And another reason why I didn't was because our School of Education had a reputation for having very conservative, old school teachers and faculty. And it was one of our most white majors as well. So I majored in political science, international relations, and Spanish. And I thought, I'm going to maybe work for the UN, or I'm going to go into sub-Saharan Africa and work for educational access there, or maybe Central America. And the more I reflected on my past experience, the more I was realizing that, we need good Black teachers here in the United States, just as much as we need good teachers everywhere. So I felt the call. I started teaching English in Valparaiso, Chile. I taught English and microfinance to single moms who were looking to get a loan to start their small businesses. So that was a really rewarding experience, and grew to see myself as a teacher. And finally decided, why not try it, right?
Yeah.
Try out teaching. And I was pretty passionate about STEM as well, because I tell this all the time. The reason why I think I'm a good math instructor is because I was a terrible student. I struggled so much in math. My sister had to reteach me algebra like almost every night. It was just a really tough point for me. And so I felt like I never had teachers that understood what it was like to be bad at math. I had teachers that really liked math and that were kind of like, hey, it's easy, but I didn't feel they understood my experience. So when I got into education, I was passionate about women, and especially Black women in STEM. I started off teaching 5th grade self-contained, and I absolutely loved it. And I realized that one of my strengths was moving students that other teachers had struggled to move academically. And that's what drew me into intervention. And so I taught intervention it was a K-8 school. So I really enjoyed that experience as well, because there's so much talk in the culture of education, right, about the achievement gap, the opportunity gap. These kids are behind, they're behind grade levels. What do? We can't catch up. Intervention. And so I really felt like for all the money and resources and airtime we give this, why isn't it working? So I really wanted to see for myself. I wanted that experience of being with a kid that was 3 grade levels behind and having to move them in a year. And I really enjoyed, and I learned so much during that time as well. And it kind of just kept going from there. I, with my initial successes and just my attitude of taking initiative, I was really called to school leadership. And so I had a couple of folks reach out to me, and some really great mentors along the way that encouraged me to do some consulting work on ed models, to eventually, joined a founding team of a school, and there I taught middle school math and science, and I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
It was kind of my dream position. I was working with all students of color. One thing about me that's kind of a fun fact is a teacher, I've never had a white student because I've
Oh,
been
wow.
working in California and in San Francisco, Oakland, and LA.
Yeah.
And so very diverse places. So I had a really wonderful founding experience. And right around then was Black Lives Matter beginning to explode.
Okay.
And if you have been in education for a while, you know that there has always been multiculturalism, diversity, teaching about Harriet Tubman, teaching about MLK, right? And those, Cesar Chavez and those kind of one-offs.
Right.
But it wasn't really until maybe 2015, based on the Black Lives Matter movement really being thrust into public discourse,
Right.
that I think education started to think seriously about comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's what led to my first position as the equity and inclusion coordinator, which is kind of a silly role, but it didn't really exist. So it was a time when we weren't sure what that looked like, right?
Yeah.
We knew diversity was important, but what does it look like to have a dedicated administrator whose job it is to break down systems of inequity in a school?
Yeah.
I'm still trying to figure out what that means all the time necessarily. So that was my first experience, and I dipped my toes into that pool. And there's a lot of great work that still needs to be done. And yet, despite the fact that we do have folks that is their position, and you can get certified and you can learn about that and go to school for it and conferences and et cetera. And yet the problem persists. It remains, right? We still are facing serious educational inequities, which have been further highlighted by distance learning. And again, the rebirth almost of Black Lives Matter that we experienced with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and their subsequent not being able to get justice. Right. And so for me, what has been always my motive in education is making sure that students who look like me feel seen and feel valued and are given the tools that they need to flourish and thrive. And so my career has just kind of put me in different pockets to live out that same mission, but it's looked very different in different places. But I've learned something really important from all of those positions. And I always stay grounded, in my roots, as initially before I was a teacher, I was a student. So I liked that to animate me, right? What was I like as a kid? What did I need? What would I have appreciated? And so far, it's been a really exciting journey, and one that I don't really know what the next step is. Folks out there who are teachers, it's kind of like you become a teacher and then you become a principal, and then, but there's not a clear path. There's not a lot of different ways of moving horizontally and vertically in this profession. So I don't know what the next phase is, but grateful for all the learning I've had along the way.
Yeah, I mean, all of that just sounds so incredible. I myself really identify with a lot of what you were talking about in intervention. Like, I'm a special education math teacher, and I just think it's so rewarding. And I also just love, like, when there's other women in STEM positions and teaching that, because it's just not something that, I mean, I really saw when I was a student. I had all like male teachers and things like that, just kind of bringing more to the table for students. And a lot of what you were talking about towards the end was kind of about how Black Lives Matter started to impact kind of what you were seeing in the classroom and how you were approaching things. And I kind of wanted to hear how either, just your visions of what a good education looks like, or how like a school should function, has kind of shifted, especially as like our political state has kind of changed, and like what sorts of changes you've seen your students needing. And kind of, I think that there's a lot of students in a lot of places that probably have a lot of needs, just with how, what is going on around them, kind of what you've seen, what you think are some good practices, like just your thoughts on kind of how that's changed everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so when I was a student, it was the day of we don't see colorblindness. That was the law of the land.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of well-meaning, very sweet white educators that tried to assure me that they did not see my color, right? But then, when I go home and I'm living in a very different neighborhood than my friends, right? Because I went to a school, I went to a Montessori school. So a lot of the folks who actually knew about the school and were able to get into the school were a certain type of family that was not my family, but my parents were savvy enough to recognize that the elementary school down the street did not provide excellent educational options for me and my sisters. So they had us go to a different school. So to be told that you don't really see color when my experience is telling me something else, when the way I'm treated even by my classmates, someone's clearly seeing some color here, right? So I think that was an unfortunate phase in our history as educators, that we all really subscribe to that. And I think we subscribed to it because it felt good. It felt nice to say, I don't care. This, I mean, that's great in theory. And so I don't fault people for falling into that, but that was a long phase, quickly followed up by what's still happening right now is a very keen focus on representation, which is absolutely critical, right? Representation does matter. We need the books. We need The Hate You Give. We need Amazing Grace. We need Kwame Alexander's books. We need Brown Girl Dreaming. We need Inside Out and Back Again. We need all the representation in all the books. But it's one thing to see yourself, right? And to have that mirror. And it's another thing to build critical consciousness and awareness and understanding and tell kids the truth. Because we can teach Esperanza Rising, but unless we're telling the real truth of the history of immigration in this country and what's still going on right now, right? Wherein Esperanza's family might be in cages. If we're not telling the truth in the whole story, then yes, it feels good to be seen and recognized, but you're not helping those students access the education that they deserve. And that education includes the truth, it includes critical consciousness building, and it includes identity development. And so when I think about different pockets of best practice, I love representation. I love the movement to diversify your bookshelf, but I would also push folks to decolonize their bookshelf. And what I mean by that is be careful of what stories you're telling, know the history of what stories you're telling, and teach kids the truth about who benefits, right? So even if you say, this is my curriculum, I have to use it. Okay, well, how are you unpacking it for students? Are you teaching them that curriculum is the truth? Capital T truth, there's nothing else? Or are you teaching them that curriculum is written by certain types of people, certain people aren't in the room, and the way that we remember history serves a very particular purpose? And that's not to say that you can't, teach the same things. Like people often say, well, we have to teach revolution and we have to teach about all these great white men in history and we have to teach the founding fathers. And I don't necessarily think that in of itself is problematic. I think we spend too much time talking about them personally, but I think that they are historical figures, right? So sure. But ask yourself how you're teaching. Are you telling the students George Washington's dentures are wooden? Or are you telling them the truth, which is that they were pulled from the mouths of his slaves? Are you talking about Sally Hemings? Also, there's so many gray areas that we've allowed to be pushed to the margins because of fear of kids aren't ready or our own uncomfortability with the subject and our own stuff that we're kind of bringing to the table. And so I think if I could isolate it into a few things, it would be do your internal work, do your research, read, listen, and learn until you get to a point where you feel comfortable, whatever racial identity, heritage, background you're bringing, know that you're bringing something. Know that to be a white educator means something, right? You are bringing something to the table, and interrogate that. That's a long process. That's not a turnkey step. The second thing would be thinking about how you're building critical consciousness in your students. Are you giving them opportunities to see multiple perspectives? Are you talking to them about what it means to be a critical thinker? Are you teaching them to be inquisitive and ask questions, even about something that is true, right? Even about something that is so obviously true, down to word choice. Why do we call Christopher Columbus an explorer instead of a colonizer? Very simple things, right? And then the third thing I would say is, teachers can kind of start to think about is just recognizing that there are so many little opportunities all throughout the day that we have to change the narrative and change the history and the trajectory of our students. Just the way that you respond, right, to a situation, and even pass rates, like using a student was telling me they're frustrated because their teacher keeps saying boys and girls.
Oh, yeah.
Like addressing the students as boys and girls, right? There's little things that we do in our language, in what books we pick to read, and who's on our walls, you know, what we decide to talk about and amplify. All of those small things add up to the experience that's really important for our students of color in schools, and the white students as well. I think people make the incorrect assumption that anti-racist teaching and abolitionist teaching is just about Black and brown students.
Yeah.
We're all drinking the same Kool-Aid. You know, your white students deserve to know the truth too.
Yeah.
Because what happens in our education system is we learn one thing, and then what happens? Kids go to college and they're like, what?
Yeah.
I didn't know any of this. Oh my gosh. And we're seeing that right now with Gen Z, which is a generation that is deeply betrayed by the lies that we told them, right? I think what you're seeing is betrayal, is the response to betrayal. And there are white students in that as well that also need the truth. So I would say those would be like three main things to think about when you're approaching this work, and three things that I see are really glaring opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate what you were saying about even within kind of a standardized curriculum, because I think that that's where a lot of teachers kind of, whether they use that as an out because they don't want to put in the work, or if they just genuinely don't understand, because I think a lot of schools don't really provide teachers with instruction and training in how to take, you know, whatever curriculum it is that you're using or whatever text it is that you're reading, and actually just kind of talk about with the kids, like, hey, this was written about these people, by these people, for these readers, for this purpose. Like, and they just expect the kids, I think if you don't explain those things to them, kids from a young age just, they say, yeah, whatever they tell me in school, great, like this is it, this is all the information that is out there, or else they would have told me something different. So I think by not providing that broader spectrum, like, it really is a disservice to all of the students. So I think that that is just such important work. The next thing I wanted to ask you about was kind of within your own classroom and school and community, how do you try to kind of advocate for your students and kind of make partnerships with people kind of across these different, you know, whether it's another teacher, another educational administrator, or just like any person in the community, kind of how do you get them to understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to accomplish?
So are you referring to maybe if you have an administrative team that's not supportive of your work, or that? Okay. I think, and a lot of folks are facing that right now, because we are in two very different places. And I have a lot of discussions with folks in my network about this, just being, I'm in California, and the scope of what I do is fundamentally different than teachers in other parts of this country. And that's just the way it is. You know, things that, like, I have a Black Lives Matter flag in my classroom. I know that that's not something that can happen necessarily everywhere. I want everyone to keep your jobs.
I'm located in Louisiana, and there are just things, you know, I grew up in New York and I worked in New York City first, and then I came down, and it's just a very different. So, you know, I'm really interested in kind of what are some of those strategies, and how can you kind of get some people that are very much like, this is the way we've always done it, this is the way we're going to keep doing it kind of attitudes, like to see like world is changing, like what are we going to do to make sure that we're doing justice?
Absolutely. I think, you know, a lot of schools only speak one language, and that's data or funds. And so I think really making sure that you have your ducks in a row where data is concerned is essential, because what we have demonstrated over and over again, starting with culturally relevant pedagogy, which is coined by Gloria Ladson-Billings all the way back before the 90s, but really burst onto the scene in 1994, it's been proven over and over again that it works, right? That you can get stronger academic results for students when you engage them through culturally relevant or responsive pedagogy. So I think that's essential. Any teacher, you need to think about, where are my data points? Where are my receipts? How can I demonstrate the efficacy of what I'm doing? And
Yeah.
sometimes it is kind of sad to think about the fact that you have to prove yourself, but that's just, it happens to be the reality that we're in right now. So I would say find data, and if there aren't data points like that, create them. Do
Yeah.
a survey with your students, do a parent survey, engage the community in other ways,
Yeah.
right? Do it, even a teacher survey, have the teachers vote. What do you want next for PD? Teachers will
Mhm.
probably say something about culturally
Right.
relevant pedagogy, or, and even if they don't use the term abolitionist and anti-racist
Yeah.
teaching, it's, if they're not all the same,
Mhm.
but you can still squeeze it in there, because a school isn't probably going to push back on culturally responsive teaching. A
Right.
school might have a problem if you say something like, we're going to do abolitionist teaching, and I'm going to bring in, this person, and we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, right?
Mhm.
So be strategic in your wording, be strategic in your use of data, make sure that you document and write things down. If you can demonstrate that over the course of the time that you've been there, here's all the incidents that we didn't know how to respond to because of
Mhm.
cultural, we didn't have
Yeah.
abolition or cultural responsive teaching. Okay, if you can say, here's all the students we've lost, here's
Right.
our retention rate with this
Yeah.
type of student, here's what parents are saying. A lot of these schools, if you engage the parent community, the parents will straight up say, we think you treat the Black kids differently. They'll
Mhm.
straight up say that, right?
Yeah.
So making sure that you're engaging those data points when possible. I think another great way for teachers to put the stress off of yourself is I find resources that are saying similar things and incorporate them into the curriculum. So
Yeah.
whether it's you're finding a News ELA or Newsella
Yeah.
article that talks about something that you want to talk about and you just want to have a discussion, you're finding a Brain Pop video. Brain Pop has some, pretty
Yeah.
progressive videos on it, right? Vocabulary, a
Mhm.
YouTube video, getting a community speaker to come in. Maybe there's someone from a local community center that wants to come in and talk to the students about something. All using resources that are already existing and then putting them into conversation with the curriculum that you have to use, if you have to use one,
Right.
is another great way to take the pressure off yourself, because then
Yeah.
it's like, hey, it's not just Miss Smith sitting up here saying
Mhm.
this. This is an article, and y'all pay for us to have Newsella,
Right.
so this is the Newsella article that we're doing
Mhm.
today, right? So there's a lots of different avenues in different ways. And I want to stress again, the the goal, right, to stay student focused
Yeah.
cannot be emphasized enough. When I come up against adversity, I will talk about, let's unpack this, right? Let's talk about who's benefiting from this staying the way that it is right now. Because
Right.
if it's not the students, then we're not being student centered. I
Mhm.
would also leverage, if you have a mission statement or if you have
Yeah.
school values, look, usually they'll say something in the values about it.
Mhm.
Find the mission statement, find some wording,
Yeah.
make a nice PowerPoint, say, in our mission statement, it says this, here's a way that we could actualize this piece of our mission statement a little more concretely. So
Mhm.
I would definitely use that. If you have if your school has a charter, there's probably some language in the charter. There's probably language somewhere in your school's official documents that you could use to support why you think a particular pedagogical practice or move is appropriate. Now, with families, it's a little bit trickier, right? Because depending on where you are, you might have half of the families saying that they don't want their kids to be
Yeah.
talking about something. I'm fortunate enough that I haven't had that, but
Yeah.
that's when you're talking about, I'm not teaching kids what to think, I'm teaching them how to think.
Mhm.
So even if I don't think that an argument has both sides, to me, there's no both sides of Black Lives Matter. It's either you think that Black people
Yeah.
deserve basic human rights or you don't.
Mhm.
Okay. But if I am teaching in a hostile environment to that, maybe I am presenting both
Right.
sides. Maybe I am just doing critical questions and asking the students to lead a conversation as opposed to,
Right.
as opposed to leading it myself. And
Yeah.
with younger kids, I think younger kids can have these discussions as well.
Mhm.
And whether or not you agree with the political elements of something, you could just be teaching the facts, right?
Right.
So there's nothing political about teaching kids that the founding fathers had slaves.
Right. Right.
Not
Right.
political. It's just a
Mhm.
fact. And so
Yeah.
I think, hey, fact versus opinion, isn't that a third grade standard, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about, I'm making sure that everybody knows that we're talking about facts and not just opinions, but you really want to be proactive. That's another thing I would recommend. Who is, no parent who's not as progressive wants their kid to come home and be like, all of a sudden, yeah, we learned about the Black
Yeah.
Panthers today and da 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 da, right? So I would say be proactive, let families know, hey, this is what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be presenting both sides, but I think it's important. Here's why. Here's our mission statement. Here's some research on this, that, and the other that you can look into. So just making sure you cover your bases. It's annoying to have to do all of that work, but you will benefit because you won't have the headache later.
Right.
And so to surmise, I would say like looking for language in the mission statement or the school's charter or whatever it is that supports what you're doing, and making sure you have data to support that this work works with students, which it does. There's plenty of data out there.
Yeah.
Being intentional about the rollout when it comes to parents and families, and engaging community partners and
Right.
resources that are not created by you, that you can implement so that the focus isn't on your opinion, it's on you leveraging resources that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I think the idea of research is just such a strong way, and of like using that kind of data to back you up. Because I think that, like you said, I mean, so many schools are like, show me the data or else we're not having the conversation. And I think that that's, yeah, like you said, you shouldn't have to justify these sorts of things and you shouldn't have to come up with reasons, but you know, like just having that kind of as your backup in case, it's just a way to make sure that you're like totally prepared, and whatever obstacles are going to come, like you're already preemptively like are prepared to overcome. I think that's really strong advice. And I think that that's definitely gonna be super helpful for a lot of teachers out there that have been struggling with like, how do I actually get everybody on board with this? Something else that you've kind of touched on is this like anti-racist teaching and abolitionist teaching. And I would love for you to just kind of talk more about like what that looks like, what that means for you, and kind of how other people can start to learn more about it and then really dive right into it and bring it to their own classrooms.
Well, so to start, I would say learn more about it. The first book, and I don't have it, if I had it like nearby, I would show you, but it's We Want to Do More Than Survive by Dr. Bettina Love. Okay. That is the essential text on abolitionist teaching right now. That's like the abolitionist teaching Bible. Yeah. So I would definitely recommend starting there if you want to just kind of figure out what is it. Another great book that isn't just about teaching, but it is helpful, is this book is Antiracist. That's another, it's got a lot of activities throughout it. I like it because it's a very entry-level text. I would call it like start there, stage one. Yeah. So there's a lot of literature out there that can support other ways to learn about it. There are now starting to be some webinars, conferences, kind of about this sort of work. So keep an eye out for those things. I learned a lot just from Instagram. I have a really, Instagram is my kind of my teacher presence, Teachergram, if folks are familiar with Teachergram. It's a thing. And so I enjoy learning there because it's quicker. It's a quicker way to disseminate the information, right? It's kind of like you just do a post and it's out there. So I would say leverage social media when possible. That's the way to really start learning about it. Another book that I would recommend is Cultivating Genius by Goldie Muhammad. That's another one that's really good and a little bit more, it focuses on more strategies that teachers can implement. So if you're looking for something that's more tactical, I would pick that one. What is this work? How can you start this work? Where to jump in? I think the number one thing to realize is that the perfect book with strategies and a list doesn't exist. Yeah. And for teachers, that's a struggle for us because we love a strategy book. We love steps. We love a implementation video. Yeah. And that's because it is a profession where we're kept like right at the cusp of being exhausted. Yeah. So it's hard to want to unpack something and make it work for your own classroom. We really we do that in the summer maybe, but then during the year, it's hard to imagine what that looks like. But there isn't a text that will give you step-by-step how to be an anti-racist or abolitionist teacher. And the reason why is because it's a mindset. It's an approach. It's not a pedagogical checklist that you can go down. There are lots of things not to do, right? Yeah. Kind of like I will tell you for sure when I see something that's not anti-racist, but it's going to look different for different people and different grade levels and different contexts. Yeah. So accepting that is important. I think that it cannot be overstated the importance of internal work. And the reason why is because we are all a product of a racist and oppressive educational system that socialized us for very specific things. And whether or not we were able to shake those mental models and able to shake those assumptions that were programmed into us, we inherit it, we carry it. It's almost an epigenetic thing where it's in our DNA. So it's important that you're able to unpack for yourself. Think
Yeah.
about your own experiences, think about what your racial identity development has been like. And that's important for white teachers too. I think we are incorrect in assuming, oh, identity development, Black and Latinx kids and Asian kids. No, white kids need identity development as well. White is an identity. White is a culture, right? It's something that folks need to investigate and learn about. So I think starting there, things like implicit bias, things like white privilege, things like white guilt are all important things to start with unpacking. There are lots of resources on that, but I think that accepting that this is an internal journey where you are going to be continuously interrogating, unpacking, and unlearning, and learning new ways of being is essential. So don't get frustrated and feel like, oh, I'm not anti-racist yet. I would not, in most of my career, in no way would I call myself an anti-racist teacher. Like if I went to my first year classroom teaching, that would not be what I would identify as. So don't feel like you have to start wearing that banner too early, right? It's a long process. So I think that would be my advice. And how other things that I think about becoming an anti-racist and abolitionist practitioner, right, is knowing that you also are always learning with your students, but there is a sense of urgency around it. It is an urgent thing because our children are under siege. And, anybody who has access to the news knows that things are not going well. So it's important too that we understand it's a long journey, but let's have a sense of urgency about this and start figuring out what we can start doing today and tomorrow and the days after that. I think there was another part of your question too. I want to make sure I answer all of it.
I think you got my resources, all that. Oh, I guess just kind of like when you envision, like you said, that if you looked back at your first year teaching, you wouldn't call that an anti-racist classroom. Do you have kind of an idea of what it would look like if you walked into a classroom and you're like, this is a good model? Like we've talked about, there's not one specific, here's, the 10 steps to build your anti-racist classroom. Like it's not going to be like that. But, in your perfect vision of what that would look like, are there any kind of key features that you would hope to see?
Yeah. I think one thing that does not get talked about enough in the discourse around abolitionist or anti-racist education is breaking down the sentimentalist mindset. If folks are familiar with Zaretta Hammond, she talks about the sentimentalist, and that's the teacher that lowers their expectations, usually out of their own guilt, but they feel bad for students, like, oh, this poor student, their first language is in English, and they have all of these barriers, et cetera, and they end up lowering their expectations or changing their perception of what that student is able to do. So I think that's an important piece. Now, when I say high expectations, I don't necessarily mean in the way that we're obsessed with racist state standards, because you also have to realize, like, we're having high expectations and we want rigor, but the standards themselves are kind of trash. So we do unpack those. Like they're not doing anyone a service right now. So I would say high expectations are important in recognizing that our students' backgrounds are an asset and make them even more capable of flourishing, not less capable of flourishing. And so I would say, especially, I think an easy thing to think about is math, because math standards are kind of, it is what it is, right? But we still have an underperformance of people of color in STEM, right? And I think that's because we're not leveraging culturally responsive practices, and also we have a lot of people that feel like somewhere deep down a tiny part of their mind is saying that scientists are white guys. Right? So it's kind of like, it's not that surprising that you're not doing well, because scientists are white dudes. So I think unpacking that is essential. I think it'll be a teacher that incorporates music and community. Another thing that I think is so tragic is just the lack of academic discourse. And I always say that, you know, a classroom should be soccer, not tennis.
Yeah.
The kids should be vibing off of each other, not just going back and forth with the teacher. So I think
Yeah.
that's definitely something that I would look to see. I would look at the walls. I would look at the bookshelf for sure. I would look at how the time is structured. Is it just your basic, always the same, you know, I'm the teacher with the direct instruction and I'm going to instruct you for 30
Yeah.
minutes and then you're going to go do it. And then maybe we'll review tomorrow. Maybe we won't even review,
Yeah.
right? Or are you experimental? Do you use a flipped classroom? Do you do Ignite Chunk Chew sometimes? Do you do collaborative work sometimes, right? Do you co-construct knowledge, project-based learning? I think all of those things create a tapestry of, you know, a tapestry of learning that makes sure you're meeting different students' needs. Because it's not just about like this student is Latinx, so they learn this particular way. It's about there are neuro scientific differences between all kids.
Yeah.
And so are we giving them ample opportunities? I would say another thing I look for in an anti-racist and abolitionist classroom is regardless of whether or not the school, right, is on point. Because the reality is the goal is abolitionist schools, not just classrooms. The goal is that your school is a community school and the people of the community have a say in how the school is run. And there's an inherent connection, and that school and that community work together to push those students to whatever success looks like for that community, not just so that they can go to a predominantly white college and have, you know, the white American middle class version of success, but our own version of a success, right? That's the ultimate goal. But how does the teacher navigate that, right? Do you say, okay, you know, I think that this schedule isn't great, but I'm going to make it work by making these adjustments, and I'm going to eliminate all the barriers that I can in my sphere of influence, and recognize that as a teacher, long term, my goal is to advocate and empower folks who are trying to make bigger changes. I think that's essential too. You know, you can be at a school that maybe isn't all the way there, but teachers are advocates in a lot of ways. Teachers are activists, and we need to be fighting to make sure that the global experience is getting better. Those are just a couple of things that I can think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really like you're talking about that the community should have a say kind of in what the school is like. And I think that's something that just isn't thought about that much. I think it's like, oh, you just send your kids to school and whatever the school is doing is probably fine.
Right. And it's like, who are you? I don't know any of you people, right? Like how many schools do the teachers actually come from that community? No, it can't be, because teachers are over 80% of teachers are white women. So they can't be coming from the community.
Right. Yeah, I think that that's such a important thing that just really doesn't get thought about in a lot of places, even that do have, you know, what are supposed to be kind of these small community schools, where it's still not necessarily like of and by the community. I think that's a really strong point. I had one other thing that's a little bit unrelated, but you had kind of mentioned that you post a lot on Instagram to get information out there. And there was one thing you had posted about that I found really interesting, and it was about kind of red flags when you're looking for a job somewhere, and kind of things to like note when you're going to a school. And I think I just found that really interesting. I just hadn't really ever seen something like that before. And I think that, you know, when going to work in a new school, I think that in my head, you know, and I'm sure other teachers as well, kind of have whatever checklist of things. You're like, oh, what's my classroom going to be like? And what's my schedule going to look like? And those kind of things. So I think that what you were pointing out was really interesting. And I'd love kind of to hear more about that and kind of what you think teachers should do. You know, if you're there and all of a sudden you start to notice, you know, some of these issues.
Yeah, and those are all based on a true story. Those are things that I experienced as a Black woman working in schools. It's challenging, and there's not yet a strong community of Black educators, at least where I am, to where we're all looking out for each other, like avoid this place, you know, and especially with how many charters we have, it's less clear, right? It's less clear where, you know, I think people can say, oh, this district
Right.
But there's so many of these little charters. It's like, okay, well, what are they about? I don't know. And I work at a charter, so it's not that I think that I'm not, but I am automatically suspicious, right? Because you're an autonomous body, and I need to know what you got going on. I think a lot of folks focus on the environment, like the conversation in the faculty room and my hours and what are my preps. Do I have a TA? And all of that is important, but especially as a person of color, there's some other things that could really impact you in a way that you don't even realize that are a lot less easy to see. And one thing I talked about was, what are the structures for development, right? Because what a lot of, and this is not just me, teachers of color will tell you, this is our experience. If we rock the boat or we're seen as controversial, all of a sudden, if either we're fired, we're coached out, we have bad results on our evaluations, right? And so I think knowing, like, who am I reporting to? What are the structures for advancement? You know, maybe I'm a teacher, but one day I want to be a grade level lead.
Right.
Okay, how do you pick the grade level lead? Is it whoever the principal likes at that moment? Or is there a process? And so I think all of those things contribute to how our experience is, and you need to ask about it, because you could end up in a situation where you're at a school and you realize there is no future for me here. And I'll never have that teacher leader position, or I'll never be able to, I don't know, pick the grade level that I want to teach because of this going on. Another thing that I think is really important to notice how they talk about kids and families. The language that you use, if it's those kids, these parents never want to come to parent teacher conferences, or like, oh, that mom is so loud and abrasive, or these parents just want to do this, or like, those kids are the bad kids, they always do X, Y, and Z. A lot of that is racially coded.
Right, absolutely.
A lot of that is racially coded language, and a lot of times it's the little black boys that are the ones always in detention, or the Latinx boys, or it's the black girls that have an attitude, right? It's oh, so and so is so sweet, and it's the quiet Asian child. So I think we need to be aware of these things, because if you're a person of color, the way that they're talking about those kids is probably the same way they're talking about you. You have more in common with the kids than you do your white coworkers. And so you need to be aware of the type of culture that is being circulated, and the way that they're talking about families as well. That's a huge problem I see in education, is we have so clearly a fixed mindset about our families. It's a very, and if you're a teacher and you have black and brown kids, then you're one of those families.
Right.
So you need to be aware of these types of things. I would say check for that, but then also be a part of the change and highlight these practices. Look for whatever laws you have, whether you have a union, whether you have, an agreement. Look for ways of saying, hey, this is missing. It's what's missing is we don't isolate how we talk about kids, or we don't have a PD that talks about how to use asset language when talking about our students, or we don't have a clear structure for how this person went from teaching 1 year and all of a sudden they're the VP, and I've been here for 5 years, and because you don't like that, I'm aggressive, I'm still a teacher, right? So I think you just need to make sure that if those things are coming up, then you're looking and bringing it to folks' attention and protecting yourself. Sometimes it's not smart to go right to your principal. Sometimes you do need to use HR. Sometimes, and I would always recommend, CC and BCC everybody you can. Okay, have these conversations via email first before you talk about them in person. That way there's a clear documentation. Little things like that are really essential. Was there anything else specifically that I said on that post that you wanted to ask about?
No, I think you just gave like a really broad overview of kind of some of those things. And I think specifically, I mean, I've just really seen, and like you mentioned, kind of the way that people talk about the students can be so illustrative of kind of their own mindsets. And, it's often people that are going to say like, oh no, not me. And I'm like, but you, just from kind of that like ingrained thing that a lot of people aren't even thinking about. And I think it's important to pay attention. Like when you're going somewhere, and also calling it out when you hear it, like, hey, what did you mean when you said those kids? You know,
Right.
like, don't try to hide behind this like very
Right.
language. It's like, I think I know what you meant. Like, just if you mean it, like, I'm gonna call you out and make you say it. Like, then we'll have that conversation.
Right.
I think that's
I'm a big like, can you unpack that for me?
mm-hmm.
Or which kids?
Yeah.
Let's unpack that comment just a
Yeah.
little bit. Help
Mm-hmm.
me understand. I must be missing something, so help me
Yeah.
understand that comment.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of talk about that. The last thing I wanted to make sure we kind of touched on was just, I want to hear more about your educational justice working group and kind of how some of our readers and viewers and all that can get involved.
Yes. So I felt like I was doing this work alone in a
Mm-hmm.
way
Yeah.
because you have like that teacher at every school has that teacher like, oh,
Yeah.
so and so always does the talent show, and Deonna's the one who always does like the black teacher kid stuff, blah
Yeah.
blah 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 blah, right? So I was that teacher, and I felt like I was experiencing things that I needed to unpack and debrief, and I was learning things that I wanted to interrogate further, and I wanted to implement things, but I needed feedback. I needed critical friends to
Yeah.
help me think through my process, and I also wanted to share my successes and also the things that did not go well for me. And
Yeah.
that's where that post came from.
Yeah.
All of those are my real experiences, and I'm trying to help y'all out
Right.
there from going through the drama that I had to go
Yeah.
through. So I wanted to create this space. Well, really, first I looked for a space,
Yeah.
found I couldn't really find one. So I wanted to create this space, and I played around with the names, and I just ended up with Educational Justice Working Group because we are fighting for educational
Yeah.
justice specifically. And we're not just talking about culturally relevant teaching. It is important, but we're going past cultural relevancy.
Mm-hmm.
We're going past anti-racism even.
Yeah.
We're talking about justice. We
Yeah.
want justice because a harm has been done, and we want it rectified and to be ensured that it will never happen again. And I'm not just talking about Black and brown students. I'm talking about female students, students with a different immigration status, religious minority students, right, all across the country. So the group is just a group of educators who are committed to this work. I provide resources in the form of videos, reading guides. We have a book club. So I provide a lot of videos that explain even things like terminology or
Yeah.
what really is. I have a long video on, essential things to know about anti-racist teaching versus abolitionist teaching.
Yeah.
And so I try to create learning opportunities, but then what also we do is we discuss everything else going on around all of the webinars, right? Have you ever been to a webinar and you're like so juiced and you're like, oh my God, that was so great and my mind is blown. And then it's kind of like, and what do I do now?
Yeah.
Like, I don't really know what to do with this information because
Yeah.
it's important, but how do I make sense of it?
Right.
So I wanted to provide a space for that too, where if I see something really dope, like an example is I just saw Dr. Pina Love wrote an article, I think for Ed Week.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's all talk about that. We
Yeah.
all read it.
Right.
So let's figure out how we can implement it. What is she calling on us to do? How can I support you do that? So we those are, I think, the crucial elements,
Yeah.
right? I provide content and professional development resources for teachers that want to learn more about this work, as well as a book club. We Want to Do More Than Survive.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're reading This Book is Anti-Racist. We're going to read another. We do about a book a month, but
yeah,
it's loose because I get it. We're teachers.
yeah.
Really. And then we unpack other things that are going on in the educational news cycle, I guess,
right,
and figure out what it means for us. And so, and then also, like, I answer a lot of questions, right? We
right.
just chat.
Yeah, that makes
We'll
sense.
say, hey, this particular thing is going on. Do you have any advice, or
Right.
can I jump on a Zoom with you and talk about this, that, or the
Yeah,
other? So it's just a community of folks, and I'm excited about it. What I would love, my eventual goal is to be able to, I not necessarily webinars, because I feel like webinars are kind of hard, but
yeah,
whether it's like a podcast or it's
yeah.
pre-recorded things that you can access at your leisure,
Mm-hmm.
have more opportunities for folks to get this type of learning. Because the reality is you're just not going to get it at school. Like the
Yeah.
odds are very low that
Right.
you're going to get sustained high quality professional development in abolitionist teaching practices.
Yeah.
Right? That's just probably not going to happen.
Absolutely.
So that's a little bit about our group. And I love our group. We call it EDGE.
Yeah.
EJG, EDGE.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I'm really glad that you got to touch on that a little bit. And, you know, I'm really excited and hoping that some of the people that watch this then kind of go out there and learn more about it specifically, because you're just so incredibly knowledgeable about all of these things. And I think that
Thank you.
there's so much to offer that, I would love for, people to be able to go and access, like you were saying, some of this information, because it just isn't, unfortunately, like a top priority at a lot of schools right now. And yeah, you're kind of filling that gap for the teachers that are eager to take advantage and learn more about that and bring that to their own schools.
Yeah.
But that was my last thing. So if there's anything else that you want to add, please feel free. I feel like we covered a lot.
I know I said a lot. I'm like, ooh, I need some water. I would just say, this work it's long work, but try to find the joy.
Yeah.
It's a labor of love. It doesn't all, and every lesson doesn't have to be the sad truths behind everything that happened. And every time you reflect, it doesn't have to be, oh my gosh, all the ways the white people did everybody else in the world dirty.
Mm-hmm.
It's a labor of love, and you should be able to find joy in it, because ultimately it's about allowing our kids to flourish,
right,
to thrive, to just like come to school and feel like, yes, this is my place. Like I'm loving it. I'm living my best life at school. And who doesn't want that, right? And we want to create that experience for them. So try to connect to that joy, and don't feel too discouraged if it doesn't come naturally to you right away, or if it takes a lot of work, because it's a long process. We got 400 plus years of colonialism to undo.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Deonna, for taking this time. I've personally just loved listening to you speak, and I know that everybody that watches this is going to be really, really excited as well to kind of access some of this information. So again, I just really thank you for taking the time.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Bye.
Bye-bye.